Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Edward Watts, who is a professor of history at the University of California, San Diego. His specialty is Roman and early Byzantine history, and in particular the religious and intellectual life of these times. He's written a number of prize-winning books covering, amongst other topics, the end of the Roman Republic and the life and the infamous death of the philosopher and mathematician Hypatia of Alexandria. And if all that seems a bit gloomy, he's gone one step further with his latest book, which is called The Eternal Decline and Fall of Rome, The History of a Dangerous Idea. And it's that book that we're going to talk about today. So welcome, Ed, to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, even if I am gloomy.
Well, I said your books sounded a bit gloomy. We've got the fall of the Republic, you've got the murder of Hypatia, and now we've got not just the decline, but the eternal decline of Rome. So is this an artifact of history itself, or is this just your take on history?
I think what's interesting about the concept of the decline and fall of Rome is that for Romans, this is gloomy, but there's a sort of redemption story always packed into this. So when Romans are talking about the decline, they're also always talking about the renewal, right? Decline is, in a sense, a way to identify a problem and then spark some kind of a renewal that makes Rome better than it had been before you acknowledge there's a decline. And so the story that we tell of the Roman Empire is that it fell, right? This is what if anyone knows anything about Rome, the first thing they know is that Rome fell. But for Romans, the story is not about falling. The story is about declining and then restoring and rehabilitating and resurrecting the things that had made Rome great in the first place. So I think for us, the narrative is certainly gloomy. For Romans, the narrative is maybe a gloomy present, but a promising future. And so there's always a positive in the Roman context attached to this negative. At least that's the promise that they're making.
And so is this idea that you want something to happen, but people won't do anything unless they're persuaded that there's a crisis. So you almost have to sell them on the idea that there's a problem, and the problem is the decline. So is this why you got this motif which sort of keeps on repeating itself down through the history of Rome?
Yeah, it becomes in a way a motif that inspires a kind of urgency in people's minds, right? There's a condition that we need to respond to. But I think across Roman history, we see kind of three different ways this is used. I think the most positive way is there's a real problem, and we as a society can come together and address this problem by focusing on the issues that caused it, but then also focusing on the things that we collaboratively can all do together to make our society stronger. And some of the most famous kind of heroic moments in Roman history reflect that. The most famous perhaps is the Republic's response to Hannibal, which is this catastrophe where the entire power structure that the Roman Republic depended upon in Italy collapses because of Hannibal. And Rome basically gathers itself up and commits to a military mobilization and a kind of total way of fighting warfare that galvanizes everyone in society, gives everyone a role to play, and moves the Republic into this position of trying to recover what it had lost. And across Roman history, you see moments like this occur sometimes. Marcus Aurelius, in responding to the emergence of smallpox in the 170s, is a great example of this. But there are others as well, where Roman society in times of crisis can identify a way to bring everyone together, identify the capacities that every Roman has, and make everybody a part of the solution. There are also moments where there is a real problem, and Romans, instead of deciding to solve the problem, instead kind of turn in and start attacking each other and blaming each other for causing the problem. And in that context, you get civil wars, you get other kinds of violence in the society because the society identifies there's a real issue that it needs to respond to, but it doesn't collaboratively come together to fix the problem. It instead just focuses on blaming other people for causing it. But I think the most insidious type of decline is when there really isn't a serious problem, but somebody creates the idea that there is one to try to build his or her own profile up. And in doing so, attacks other people who are political opponents. And so in a sense, you're creating division in Roman society, not because there's a real issue that needs to be fixed, but because you want to elevate your own position. And this is a very easy way to get Romans to do things they otherwise wouldn't be willing to do.
What would be your most egregious example of that?
I think, unfortunately, Roman history has a lot of examples of that.
Okay. Give us one of your top 20.
The most egregious, I think that, the biggest villain maybe in all of Roman history is Sulla, who is a Republican commander who is removed from a position that is a kind of easy and lucrative military command that's going to lead to an easy and lucrative victory, and that will elevate his profile and elevate his own personal fortunes. And when he's removed, and it is kind of shady how he was removed, but when he's removed, he goes to his army and says, the Republic is not functioning like a republic anymore. The Republic has collapsed. It's now controlled by demagogues, and we need to march on Rome to fix this. And so Sulla then takes an army that is the property of the Republic and soldiers who are serving their country, and he turns it into a personal army that he basically deputizes to take back the military command that Sulla wanted. And so he takes an army of citizens and has them march on their own city for his own personal benefit. And he uses this idea of a declining Republican system to justify an action that is, inherently incredibly selfish and destructive.
I'm always surprised at how Sulla seems to get pretty easy ride from historians, because people sort of see him as being on the way to Julius Caesar. And it's Julius Caesar they really want to, and if you'll forgive the expression, they really want to stick the knife into, right? But if you look at Caesar, he famously, I don't know if he executes anyone, but if he does, it's an absolute handful. Whereas Sulla, notoriously, he's giving his speech while the senators can hear, the screams of the people being murdered in the circus, a few hundred yards away.
I think unpacking that massacre that you just described is really important, because what Sulla has done is he's taken a group of Romans who were fighting, they are Roman citizens, but they are fighting on behalf of the person that Sulla is opposed to. And Sulla not only takes their citizenship away, but he executes them en masse. And he does it in the circus while he has called the Senate together so he can proclaim the restoration of the Republic. And so the restoration of the Republic is a terrorizing act by Sulla that is simultaneously robbing Roman citizens of the very basic protection that citizens are supposed to have in Rome, which is, you are a stakeholder in a representative democracy that does not have the right to take away your life without really significant hurdles being overcome. And Sulla kills perhaps 10,000 people in that way. And so it is a really egregious break of everything that the Roman Republic is supposed to stand for, and it's done in the name of restoring the Republic that has declined.
So why does Caesar get such bad press? Is it simply because he's sort of the big name that's echoed down history, and so we don't want the American Caesar, MacArthur? Mm-hmm. He's sort of the American Caesar. So Caesar is sort of almost, it's been raised to this political symbol with relevance today. So we have to condemn Caesar in history because we don't like what he's come to stand for going forward. Is that fair, or was there something more sinister to Caesar, do you think?
I think Caesar is an incredibly complicated person because Caesar lived through the Sullan massacres. I mean, Caesar was young at that point, but Caesar lived through this. And as part of the Sullan massacres, his father lost his property. Caesar had to live off of his mother's property. One of the, as a parenthetical, one of the things we seldom acknowledge about Rome is women were politically, in a way, they were inoculated against political violence. And so when Caesar's family property was confiscated, his mother's property was not confiscated because you couldn't really, even Sulla couldn't really do that. But what Caesar lived through was this experience of seeing Romans lose their political rights in a way that is not part of what a republic should do. And this is actually a principled position that Caesar maintains. He saw what Sulla's massacres had done. And this is why, in 63, when Catiline rebels, Caesar speaks up in the Senate and says, we cannot take people's lives without a trial. That violates their citizen rights. And it starts a process that ends with massacres. And Caesar is almost sort of rung up on charges of abetting the conspiracy of Catiline because it looks suspicious. But when Caesar wins his civil wars, or when he's fighting his civil wars, he pardons his adversaries. And I think it is, again, a principled response that's conditioned and grew out of his experience on the other side of a civil war, because he was a loser before he was a winner. And he sees what destructive things happen when there is this victor's justice and these massacres that deprive people of their political standing. And so I think on one level, Caesar is an incredibly principled person who understood the risk that he was taking in doing this. I mean, he understood that Brutus and Cassius may not be the individuals who do this, but there could be individuals who literally stab him in the back, who he could have killed if he wanted to. And I think it was a risk he was willing to take for Rome. But he's also an incredibly ambitious person who is not willing to downshift his ambitions just because of the sort of political structures of the Republic. And so you have someone who on one level has incredible integrity and on another level has none. And it depends what story of Caesar you're going to tell. Do you want to tell the story of this person's integrity? Or do you want to tell the story of this person's ambition? And I think what we get in people like Plutarch and in later thinkers is a story of ambition. We don't get a story of integrity. And I think that conditions for us how we see Caesar. But Caesar is in some ways one of the most complicated figures in all of Roman history because there are deep-seated beliefs on one level that are profoundly pro-Republican and on another level are profoundly anti-Republican. And it's very hard to balance the two of those.
I think it's Plutarch that has the story of how on the Battle of Pharsalus, is it? He says, well, this is what my opponents wanted when he looks at all the dead on the battlefield. And so that's putting some good lines in his mouth, I think. He says, this isn't what I wanted, this is what they wanted.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's 100% true. On a bunch of levels, it's 100% true. Pompey didn't want to fight that battle either.
And the other thing I can never quite understand is how Cato and his clique get away so lightly, because it's very hard to tell because we're looking at this from so far away, but you get the sense that every time Caesar moves forward, it's in the teeth of an absolute gale of opposition. So, for example, and I find this barely understandable, when his consulship is to come to an end, his province is something like the woods and meadows of Italy or something like that. I think, well, who do you think you're dealing with? Do you really think that's going to work? Or when they're trying to compromise to stop the civil war breaking out, they give him nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, they give him absolutely nothing. And yes, he does. He's the man that starts the civil war. They're on the side of the Republic. He's on the side of Caesar. But on the other hand, and it's one of these counterfactuals, and I never know how far you can go with counterfactuals, but if they would have bent a little bit, you wonder if the story might not have been quite different.
Yeah, I think Cato, and this goes against all of Roman history and later subsequent sort of understanding of Cato, but I think Cato is the villain who collapses the Republic, finally collapses it. Because there is a generation that lived through Sulla, and they lived through those civil wars, and they were all traumatized by it, including Cato. But there is a real hesitancy to go to the place that Sulla went to for people who really had the capacity to do this. I mean, Pompey could have seized the state at multiple points in the 60s and chose not to, in large part because of the horror that went along with what Sulla had done. Crassus probably could have created major problems in the state if he wanted to. Again, is sort of held back from doing this because of the trauma of Sulla. And Caesar, of course, also was traumatized by Sulla, as was Cato. But I think with Cato, what you see are a series of almost Mitch McConnell-like decisions that are just destructive for the sake of being destructive. They're playing these really short-sighted political games that don't really do anything to defend the Republic, though that's what he claims he's doing. Instead, he's just trying to continually weaken people who are had more authority and more power than Cato did. And he's trying, in essence, to level the playing field so that Cato himself can somehow create enough static that he can emerge as the dominant figure in the state. But Cato doesn't have the wealth to do this. He doesn't have the military skill to do this. He doesn't have the popular backing to do this. And so instead, what he does is he wages campaigns to try to bring people down. And ultimately, these people come together and create first the triumvirate to defeat Cato. And then second, Caesar feels compelled to march across the Rubicon because he doesn't trust that anything that his opponents guarantee him is going to be valid because he doesn't trust Cato.
Mm-hmm. So let's skip forward a bit because there's a number of places in your book where you have a fairly revisionist stance, and one of them, and I'm not sure whether it is revisionist anymore, is where you stand up for Domitian, who, at least in the sources we have, is normally presented as a villain, the man who sort of sits pulling the wings off of flies, if I recall. And you say, well, actually, this Domitian, never mind the flies, he was actually quite a capable ruler.
I don't know that it's revisionist anymore because Ronald Syme was saying this, a while ago even. When you look at the economic policies of Domitian, they're actually incredibly sophisticated and really, really smart. And his military policies are as well. I think the way to tell the story of Domitian is first to start with why we have such a negative view of him. And the reason we do is because Domitian is killed in a coup by one of his associates, an intimate of his, the future Emperor Nerva. And what follows is a run of some of the greatest authors in all of Roman imperial history, guys like Tacitus and Plutarch and Suetonius and Pliny, all line up and attack Domitian. And they do this in large part because they were very closely associated with Domitian, and they had done very well under Domitian. And so what you have is a kind of aggressive sort of response, and in a sense, a reaction to defend your own purity and your own integrity after Domitian has fallen. And none of these people were showing these things while Domitian was alive. They all are very positive towards Domitian while he's living. Suetonius we know the least about under Domitian, but the others we all see are prominent people who get advanced into prominent positions very quickly because of Domitian. Pliny is one of the most vicious critics of Domitian, and the only reason Pliny is even important is because Domitian let him skip a whole bunch of steps and rise very quickly to a position of prominence. And so what these guys are doing is, in a sense, overcompensating for their association with Domitian. So on the one hand, I think that really undermines the integrity and trustworthiness of our narrations. But then on the other hand, when we actually look at what Domitian was up to, Domitian had a view of an imperial future that in many ways kind of prefigured what the second century would look like, an empire that isn't just run by Italians and exploiting provincials. It's instead an empire that's including more and more people from around the Mediterranean at the highest levels of society, including in the Senate and including at the highest levels of senatorial office holding. This was the Roman future, and Domitian, who has a lifetime appointment and is a young man, sees that future. And he's on the path to putting it together, and this is in a part why he's killed. We also see that Domitian had a view of the Roman frontier that's incredibly sophisticated as well. It's a frontier strategy that's based on a balance of power and not outright conquest, because you could then manage the resources of the empire much more effectively, versus a campaign of conquest gives you all kinds of need to defend territory that is very difficult to defend and build up infrastructure in areas that are not as developed as the rest of the empire. And this is a policy that Trajan abandons to go and conquer what's now Romania and then to launch a campaign into Iraq that works about as well as any campaign into Iraq. But it is eventually the policy that the Emperor Hadrian adopts and becomes the policy for the Roman Empire for the next almost 200 years. So Domitian saw the future. Domitian was also a kind of irascible and difficult character. And so that gives you the opportunity to do what these kind of overcompensating authors like Pliny and Tacitus and Plutarch ultimately did. But he was beloved by his army, and he was liked by the populace. He was disliked by Italian senators, and those are the people who wrote the history. And so there we are.
And then we go on to Trajan, and as you indicate, you don't have... He's probably the most highly regarded emperor by the Roman historians from that time on. I think they think he's probably the absolute pinnacle of what a Roman emperor should be. But I don't think that's a view that you share. And you sort of indicated that you thought that his conquest of Romania, and perhaps even more so his move into what's now Iraq, was a piece of folly.
So I think with Trajan, you're exactly right that the reputation Trajan has in subsequent centuries is outstanding, to the point where when emperors are acclaimed when they first come to power, that one of the acclamations is, "May you be like Trajan." And Trajan is an incredibly arrogant individual. If you look at Trajan's coins, what you see is a figure who the name that Trajan uses on his coins becomes longer and longer and longer because he includes all of the accolades that he achieves. And then on the, in the back of some of his last coins, he has this title, Optimo Principi, the best emperor, the best, leader of Rome. So this is not a man who, is shy about his ego. And then you compare this to Hadrian, who is his successor, and Hadrian's coins by the end just say Hadrianus Augustus. None of this sort of drama of what you get with Trajan. Part of why Trajan had this incredible ego is because Trajan unleashes this military machine that Domitian had built through sound fiscal policies, but also through very careful management of military resources. The Roman professional army is something that I think we sometimes underrate. These are incredibly capable troops. And when you do not lose large numbers of those troops, this is an army that is, unmatchable by anybody in the region, because these troops serve for, a decade or more. They are very, very well trained, and they have competence and professionalization that really just you can't get from a citizen militia or from assembling warriors from a barbarian tribe. And so when Trajan unleashes this against Romania, against the kingdom of Dacia, it's a very impressive victory. And it is something, because Dacia has a lot of gold mines, it's something that is very lucrative for the Romans as well. The campaign into Iraq is also something where the Romans win the battles, but they cannot win the war. What ends up happening is the Parthians that Trajan has attacked simply withdraw across the Zagros Mountains, and then regroup and launch, guerrilla campaigns and organize revolts. And the Romans just cannot hold the territory. They don't get defeated. They don't get sort of pushed out. They just, under Hadrian, decide it's not worth staying and they withdraw. So the legacy of Trajan is, in a sense, taking resources that were functioning quite well under Domitian and using them in a way that Romans hadn't really chosen to do since Claudius's invasion of Britain, and then using them in a way that Romans would not use them again for more than 100 years, and not sustainably really for much, much longer than that. And so I think when you see Trajan, what you see is somebody who takes an incredible inheritance that he got and uses it for his own kind of selfish needs. Some of these things make Rome better. Some of these things make Rome worse. But what they lead to is a crisis when Trajan dies and Hadrian takes over that Hadrian has to respond to.
One of the things I always wonder is that if he would have been successful in Iraq, Mesopotamia, how sustainable that would have been, because the sheer distance from Rome, of a place that now would have Roman armies having to be stationed there, you just think, how long is civil war going to take to break out? 10 years, 15 years. I think Hadrian does absolutely the right thing by calling it a day and heading back to sort of establish his own power base.
No, I think you're right, and I think that Rome had the capacity to integrate territory from that far away. But the problem with that territory is it's very, very difficult to control the lowlands of Mesopotamia if you don't control the highlands to the east as well. And the problem that Rome would have faced is it would be continuously kind of trying to defend lowland areas against attacks from places that Rome could not really respond. So I think that that's part of what Hadrian saw, is this is unsustainable. It's not easy to control Mesopotamia from the west. It's a lot easier to control it from the east. And So I think Hadrian made a very wise choice there. I think what's interesting in the concept of or the context of kind of the succession from Trajan to Hadrian is Hadrian looked at this, he saw a catastrophe, but he did not blame Trajan for it, and he didn't call it a catastrophe even though it was. What Hadrian simply said is, well, we're withdrawing back to normal boundaries, and this is a old established policy that began under Augustus. None of this is really true, but it's a very sound way to say what didn't, to say quietly what didn't need to be said openly. That Trajan's policy had failed, this was a debacle, and you needed to get out. But you didn't want to do it in a way that blamed Trajan, because Trajan was Hadrian's adopted father, and Hadrian didn't want to do that because it would undercut Hadrian's own authority. And so this is how we get the legend of Trajan as the greatest Roman emperor. We, in a sense, have only Trajan's words for this because Hadrian, who could have launched a counter-argument, never did.
And this sort of plays a bit into your argument as to this idea of decline in Rome, and in some dynasties have a strong motivation for saying we are repairing the wrongs of the past. And other dynasties want to see themselves as a continuation of a glorious present, as it were. And I guess you're saying the Antonines fall into that category.
The Antonines absolutely fall into that category. And it is so effective that even after the Antonine dynasty ends, the next dynasty actually tries to graft itself onto the Antonine dynasty by pretending that they're Antonines. Because what the Antonines are able to do is first of all, superintend a time of, in the middle of the 2nd century. It is actually, the state is functioning very well, and the emperors are doing a very good job, and they are not hit with any major crises, from later in the reign of Hadrian, pretty much all the way through the reign of Antoninus Pius and into the reign of Marcus Aurelius. And so it's only when smallpox hits at a time when Rome is also facing military campaigns along its border that you get this, you get a sense of there's, real problems again. But Marcus now has a couple of advantages. I mean, one is this Antonine legacy of, well, everything works under us. And we don't talk about Rome being in decline. We instead face problems and we fix them. And that's what happens. A functional society recognizes its problems and it repairs them. Like if a bridge is falling, we repair it. If our political structure is, struggling in some way, we repair it, and there's no drama there. It's not anybody's fault. Things happen and you fix them. And so this is part of why Marcus is able to do what he's able to do. But another part of it is Marcus is a profoundly thoughtful emperor. And so in his meditations, which, I'm very pleased to say have become bestsellers in COVID world, in Marcus's meditations, Marcus actually, says that the strategy that historians ascribe to him is what he's really trying to do. I mean, he really is trying to see everyone for what they're capable of doing, not for their failings, but for their successes, and to build a society around maximizing everyone's capacity to do what they can to make Rome better. And Marcus says this is what he's doing. And this is what the historians are saying he's doing. And so I think we should take seriously the fact that, not only is Marcus trying to do this, but Romans understood that and they appreciated it. And so the high point of the Antonine dynasty is this society that is really, not looking forward in a progressive way, but responding sensitively to the challenges that it's facing in a way that is very deliberately trying to build up everyone's sense that they belong and have a meaningful role to play.
And yet Marcus is the one who breaks the tradition of the Antonines, which is to say he allows his son to take over from him.
Yeah, and the son doesn't work out very well. This is Commodus. I think the challenge...
You made a good movie.
Yeah, there have been movies about Commodus. And in some ways, they actually understate some of Commodus's problems. Commodus, I think when we think about Marcus and the historians talking about Marcus's decision to let Commodus succeed him, historians actually say Marcus thought this was a bad idea, and there's just no evidence for that. I think that there are ways to nuance this that, make us maybe able to kind of appreciate the situation a little better. So Commodus is the first son born to a reigning Roman emperor who actually makes it to, adulthood. And the childhood of Commodus was rough. He was a twin, and his twin brother died when he was young. I think Faustina, his mother, had maybe as many as 10 children. Most of them died young. I think 3 of them make it to adulthood, and Commodus is the only male who does. And then when Commodus actually takes power in 180, his older sister, who had been married to an emperor before, and then, when that emperor died, this was a colleague of Marcus Aurelius, she retains the title of Augusta until Marcus forces her to marry someone else who is not an emperor. And when Commodus succeeds, she is jealous that her new husband is not emperor, and she plots against her brother, who at that point is, all of 20 years old. So Commodus has a rough run of things very early on. And this leads to Commodus not ending up in a very good place. He spends most of his days training to be a gladiator. He fights in the arenas, and he ends up being killed under suspicious circumstances on New Year's Eve. And his mistress and his chamberlain and the head of his imperial guards may well have been involved in doing this. So, yeah, it doesn't end well for Commodus. And in many ways, I think Rome had a real problem with Commodus in charge. But in other ways, it's interesting because after Commodus dies, you don't have lots and lots and lots of people saying, yeah, it's good he's dead. Instead, what you have are people kind of apologizing for this. I mean, Pertinax, who is the next emperor who was involved in the coup plot, he actually allows Commodus to be buried and not, condemned and with his body desecrated in the way that Romans tended to want to do. The person after this, who follows Pertinax, executes some of the people who were involved in the coup plot. Septimius Severus, who follows that emperor, starts a new dynasty where he proclaims that Commodus is a god and his adopted brother, and restarts the Antonine dynasty in part by rehabilitating Commodus. So even though Commodus was a terrible emperor, the legacy of Commodus, because he's an Antonine, is powerful enough that Romans can't actually walk away from him and say that he was horrible. Instead, they make him a god eventually. And it's a very strange fate for somebody who really was not a successful emperor, and everybody knew he was kind of a nightmare as sovereign.
Okay, so let's skip through let's skip the Severans, and I don't know if it's even possible to try and cover the crisis of the 3rd century because it's such a huge subject and it's so confusing. But how does that sort of fit into the theme of your book? Because, it's all, I'm here to restore, I'm here to restore, and then one by one, it all ends badly.
Yeah, I think the Antonine Age in the propaganda gives us this picture of this amazing time. And Gibbon fell victim to this. He says that the best time in human history to be alive is that time between the death of Domitian and the ascension of Commodus. And no, I don't think anybody would choose to live in the 170s in the Roman Empire. It's a horrible time, you have. When
would you choose to live?
Well,
obviously today, but if you had to live during the Roman Empire, when is a better time to live?
I would pick the 4th century, actually. I think that if you are a regular person, living anywhere in the Roman Empire, it's better in the 4th century than just about any time that you will face. The 1st century also probably was not terrible if you were Italian and noble, but the 2nd century, absolutely not. You have thousands, maybe 20% of the population dies of smallpox. It's not a good time to be alive. But the propaganda we get and the historians writing about the Antonine period make this out to be a golden age. In the 3rd century, Rome doesn't have a very good time of it, especially in the 250s when things are really terrible. Some version of Ebola hits at the same time that the political structure collapses. But the 3rd century is, in a sense, made to look worse because of the opposite tendency among historians and rulers that we get under the Antonines. Whereas the Antonines are giving you this picture of everything being good because it's, a time of stable political dynamics, and no one is playing this game of Rome is in decline and I alone can fix it, so let's overthrow the emperor. In the 3rd century, everyone is playing the game of Rome is in decline, I alone can fix it, so let's overthrow the emperor. So you get more than 50 emperors in 50 years between 235 and 284. That's a real problem. It's a real kind of moment of distortion that is as bad for our understanding of what's happening as this Antonine sort of happy glory, 85 years when everything works. It didn't all work under the Antonines, and it wasn't all catastrophe in the third century. So I think when we look at the third century crisis, there are really serious moments of dysfunction. And the 250s are probably, one of the worst times in Roman history to be alive. It's really it's horrible. The combination of, accounts of like bodies clogging the Nile in Alexandria because so many people are dying of plague, while emperors are dying in battle and emperors are being captured by the Persians and armies lose their ability to fight because of plague. It's a horrible, horrible time. But, the 240s are not as bad as we hear. The 260s are also not as bad as we hear. And so the third century crisis is a real crisis. But it's not always a crisis. It's not 50 years of crisis. But the stories we tell, because of the political instability, focus on crisis, because you have emperors trying to claim that the murder of a predecessor is necessary to restore a Roman state that is collapsing. And it's not always collapsing. Sometimes it's just a coup, and the state is actually doing reasonably well.
And who would want to be Roman emperor? I mean, I sometimes wonder, is it the army is sort of pushing this poor unfortunate to the front and saying, he's our man and he'll pay us and he'll give us offices and so on, and if anyone suffers, it'll be him and perhaps not us. Is that what's going on?
I think in the third century, it is a peculiar kind of arrogance where you think you alone can fix it. And there are a lot of people willing to listen to you because there's material benefits that come along with backing someone in a civil war. And I think what's important to know about a lot of these Roman civil wars is they don't actually end with battles. They end with someone saying, yeah, okay, this guy's not going to win. We're done. We surrender. And that happens a lot. There are civil wars that people do actually, lots of Romans actually do kill each other. But a lot of times, especially in some of these third century crises, it's, emperors being abandoned by their armies because their armies think about it and think, well, this other guy is more likely to win. We're not going to die for a loser. And that does produce a kind of cynical way of behaving that, that allows for a lot more rebellions. But I also think it's interesting because in the third century, less so, but you do see lots of moments when there are armies that try to proclaim someone emperor and the emperor or the person doesn't want it. It's a terrible job, really. It's a life sentence, and you can't get out of it. And there are few Roman emperors who retire, very few. You have a man named Vetranio in the 4th century who retires and lives out his life on an estate. Diocletian retires. There's a very peculiar man named Uranius Antoninus who takes power out of the city of Emesa and then disappears. He seems to have retired, but it's rare. Usually if you become Roman emperor, you're going to do it for life, and your life might not be very long.
And you sort of hinted that you didn't hint, you said that the 300s, the 4th century, was the time where for somebody in the middle of society, say, that would be the best time to be alive. So just sketch for us what's the 4th century all about in the context of sort of a decline or revival.
Yeah, one of the big challenges that the 3rd century causes is a challenge of how this society that's built around basically exploiting resources from all around the empire for the benefit of a few people in Italy can be transformed to incorporate and meet the needs of all of these people who in 212 AD become Roman citizens. And so you have a society that's an imperial society that all of a sudden becomes kind of a nation state. And the Roman government is not equipped to do that. It's not equipped to treat people in Egypt and in Italy equally. And so a lot of the story of the 3rd century is working through this imbalance where people who are now fully Roman want the protections and the support that the state has been giving people in the central part of the empire. And what happens at the end of the 3rd century under the Emperor Diocletian and then continuing under the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century is a Roman administrative apparatus is built out that actually does treat everyone more or less equally. It gives Italians, Egyptians, Syrians, people in Spain, people in Britain, equal access to imperial services, to imperial law, to courts. It also tries to ensure that resources for the defensive territories are equally spread in each place. And so it moves into a structure where the administration becomes much, much bigger. And government jobs become much, much more well-paying, and there become a lot more of them. But to make the empire work effectively across this space that is, basically the size of the United States, from Britain to Saudi Arabia. It is a massive, massive territory. To make that effective, you need to draw in people from all of those regions. And so you need to have a state apparatus that draws the best and most talented people from everywhere across the empire. And so if you are a talented person from anywhere in the empire, in the 4th century, you have the opportunity to rise really high in Roman society. And the names of some of the people who do this are really familiar to us. And St. Augustine is one of these characters. Jerome is one of these characters. Ambrose is one of these characters. John Chrysostom is one of these characters. These are all people who get this kind of training to participate in this Roman state structure. And some of them go into the church. Some of them stay in that Roman state structure. But it is a way that you can be a kind of middling, not particularly wealthy person in a 3rd-tier North African city, and ultimately, by the time you're 40, rise to be the professor of rhetoric in Milan near the imperial court. That's Augustine. And that wouldn't have happened at any other point before the 4th century, and it doesn't really happen after the 4th century.
So I can see that would be very attractive to a professor of history from California. Since you can sort of see your career mapping out quite nicely in the 4th century.
Well, I think you can also see it. I mean, with my students, you also see it. This is the thing, when it became clear to me that there is this career path and people recognize it and they understand how to train their kids for it. And this happens really, late in the reign of Diocletian, early in the reign of Constantine. Then you begin to see a set of, promises that people take seriously, an idea of an achievement-based society where talent is rewarded, where hard work is rewarded, where, there is a substantial degree of, you have to have the right connections to get these positions, but you also have to be talented. And we even see the government goes so far as keeping kind of records of how people are doing in schools in major capitals, places like Rome and Constantinople and North Africa, so that they can, and we have sources that say this, identify people with capacity so they can be brought into an imperial service position. And so they're really looking to identify talented people based not on who they are or what their parents did or what their, social status is, but their capacity. And that is a very different thing from really any time in ancient history.
So it all goes very well. We get to the year 400, and actually Rome is still the undisputed superpower. And then 76 years later, the last, man with the name of emperor in the West is being deposed. So what goes wrong in that period, and is it avoidable or not?
Yeah, I think that on one level it's avoidable, and on another level, well, this becomes a much more bigger and philosophical question. But I think the basic story of the 5th century in the West is that the empire kind of commits suicide. What you have are sets of decisions that are made by sovereigns to prioritize what seem to be likely victories in internal conflicts over maintaining the defense and integrity of the empire as a whole. And so there are definitely issues maintaining control of the frontier that really start in the 370s, but especially in the West are compounded by Alaric, who is coming from the Balkans into Italy, and a moment where the Rhine River freezes solid and a group of barbarians cross into territory that's now basically sort of Germany and France. But in the West, while this is happening, there are political machinations that first lead to the death of, the execution of the military commander in the West who could have handled these situations, and then lead to civil wars where imperial pretenders and the imperial court prioritize fighting each other over pushing barbarians out of Roman territory. And you see a series of moments where Romans prioritize these internal conflicts over restoring and maintaining imperial control over other territories that had once been part of the empire. So is that inevitable? I mean, that's then the philosophical question. The Foundation series that is now on Apple TV would, make you say, no, it is absolutely inevitable. It is a big sort of social process of decay, and this is degeneration of an empire, and this just goes par for the course with it. But I also think there's individual choices made here where if you had different sovereigns who were more secure and wise and better informed, the empire could have survived this. And so I think the fourth century gives you a set of examples of problems that are fatal to Roman control in significant parts of the Western Mediterranean, but didn't need to be, and could have been addressed more effectively had there been the will to do this.
I suppose the economists would say it's a matter of incentives. And so, it may make sense for the empire, but it doesn't make sense for the emperor to do a certain thing. So it's in his interest to win the internal battle, even if it costs the empire, strength going forward. And if that happens again and again, then in the end, the game's up. But you're concerned, with this month, you're concerned with today, you're concerned with winning this battle. You're not concerned with the position 30 years on, right?
Right. Well, and on some level, it makes sense, because if that emperor loses, he's dead, right? So he has a personal incentive to fight the civil war rather than fight the barbarians, because you can negotiate with the barbarians and they're not going to kill you. It's to their advantage to get a little piece of the empire from you, but not threaten you. Whereas the guy you're fighting, yeah, he wants you dead. But the other thing that those civil wars do, those are some of the civil wars. I mean, starting with the civil wars that the Emperor Theodosius I fights in the 380s and 390s, those are, shooting wars. Those are wars where professionally trained Roman armies fight each other. And so all of that tremendous capacity that the professional army has, they chew each other up in a way that destroys a human capacity that is very difficult to repair. And so when you get into the 5th century, the Western armies have lost those civil wars. So the Western armies have been chewed up in a way that is really, really devastating. They haven't been fully repaired yet. And so that's another aspect of this. Where you do have really clear deterioration in Roman military capacity that hasn't been fully repaired when the military and the state really needs it. And then you have that very selfish but completely understandable impulse to not die for the benefit of the empire.
I'm sort of very struck by the fact that the Rome of the Republic can put armies into the field and lose them year after year against Carthage. And yet, by the time of the mid-400s, it seems like an army of sort of 7,500 men. Well, that's a pretty substantial army. And you just think the size of the territory they're controlling, and yet their ability to project military force, it just seems to have withered away. And I'm wondering, is that something to do with the professional army? Is it just because everybody's been chewed up, as you say? Is it a combination?
They did have massive amounts of troops available in the 4th century. In the 5th century, it becomes more and more difficult. But at the time of Diocletian, I think there's estimates that the army is about 500,000 people. Right.
But I'm talking about the 400s, from sort of 400 on. Yeah, it seems like the army is a shrunken thing.
The Western armies are, because the territory they draw upon is smaller. The Eastern armies are not. The division of these territories. At least on paper, the Eastern armies are just as big as they would have been, under Diocletian, and they're really significant and powerful. I think the way to think about this, and perhaps the way that you can best conceptualize the difference between a Republican citizen army and a professional army, an imperial professional army, happens right at the verge of the empire starting. And this is around the Battle of Mutina. So this is a moment when Antony is besieging the city of Mutina because there's one of the assassins of Caesar who's taking control of it. And the Senate sends out raw recruits to go and confront Antony's army. And the raw recruits, when they confront Antony's army, they're Roman troops, right? They are equally equipped. Antony's army is a group of veterans, but they're veterans. They have experience. The raw recruits come to the field against Antony's troops, and Antony's troops just cut them to pieces. But then one of Caesar's armies shows up. And this is one of the armies that Caesar took into Gaul. This is the equivalent of a kind of Roman professional army, but these guys are hardcore. And they do to Antony's army what Antony's army had done to the raw recruits. And so there you kind of can see the difference between like a consular army that's put together in, 218 to go and confront Hannibal and an imperial army. Because the consular army that's put together to confront Hannibal has a lot of people in it. The Battle of Cannae, that is a very, very big army. But Hannibal has a professional army, and these guys are basically raw recruits, and they get, cut to pieces. When Scipio takes his army into Africa, this is a better trained army. It is not on the level of a Roman imperial army, though. So what Augustus understood was the lesson from Mutina, that if you control this professional army, it doesn't matter what somebody does to try to raise a revolt against you, because they can get a citizen army together. But the lessons from the 40s BC is one of these professional armies will always defeat a citizen army, even if the equipment is the same, even if the training is the same, even if the generalship is the same. Those troops are just better. And Augustus's insight was you keep these guys around for as long as they are, effective. And no one can build up a sort of grassroots challenge to you. The only way they can challenge you is if they have a professional army to go against your professional army. And Augustus's division is to make sure that nobody has enough troops at their disposal that they can kind of tip the balance and challenge an emperor. And it generally works. But when you get to the 5th century in the West, that kind of base of professionalization has started to collapse. And so the armies are not quite as good. The counter to that, if you want a counter to that, is when Justinian comes back into the West and he brings a good professional Roman army. He takes over North Africa with, a couple tens of thousands of troops. He marches into Italy with, 20,000 troops and basically is able to dominate most of the peninsula. This army is still an incredibly good army if you can maintain all of the structures that make it good. And in the West in the 5th century, they are not able to maintain those structures.
Okay, so let's get to the most revisionist part of your book, which is the bit that I just loved, which is your idea that 476 is not such an important date and shouldn't be the date that we put on the fall of the Western Empire. So do you want to justify that?
Sure. I think the first thing is to acknowledge that this is the story we've had for a very long time. I mean, this is the story we've had for almost 1,500 years. But we have it not because of what happens in 476, but because of what happens in the 6th century. The story is not even invented. In 476, the coup that deposed the child emperor Romulus Augustulus was the end of the Roman Empire until the 510s. I mean, that story emerges in the 510s. And it doesn't emerge in Italy. No one in Italy even knows that story. It emerges in Constantinople at a time when Justinian is looking to invade the West. And there are problems with the story. There are elements of the story that are factually obviously incorrect. So the story is that the child emperor Romulus Augustulus is deposed by a man named Odoacer, who's a commander of the imperial army. And Odoacer is a king of the Goths when he does this. And with this, the story goes, ends the Western Empire of the Roman people that started with Augustus and ends with Augustulus. It's a very neat and tidy story. Very little of it is actually going to withstand scrutiny. First of all, Odoacer is not a Goth. But the Goths are the people who control Italy when Justinian wants to invade it. And so immediately what we see there is there's a justification for creating a kind of break between Rome and the Gothic regime that can justify Rome coming back and destroying a Gothic regime. It's not based on Odoacer, who's part Hun and part something else. He's not Gothic at all. It's based on the regime that's there in the 510s. So the next part of it is Romulus Augustulus is not even a legitimate emperor. There is a Western emperor named Julius Nepos, who is still alive, and Romulus Augustulus' dad forced him to flee to Croatia, but he's still there. And so in the eyes of the Eastern court, Romulus Augustulus' deposition means nothing because Romulus Augustulus is not Roman emperor. Nepos is. And Odoacer goes so far as to put Nepos on his coins. So he's still playing the imperial game. And then after Nepos dies, oddly, he was assassinated apparently by a bishop who used to be Roman emperor before Nepos. Then the Eastern Emperor appears on the coins of Odoacer. So never is Odoacer saying this isn't Rome. And never is anybody in Italy saying we are not a Roman state anymore. There's still consuls, the Senate still meets, Roman law is still used, Latin is still the language of administration. Every measure, except for the fact that Odoacer is there, still indicates that this is a Roman, Western Roman state. And then we start getting literature talking about the Roman restoration under Odoacer, and especially under Odoacer's successor Theodoric, where they talk about things like, the empire being decrepit in the 5th century and now restored from its decline, where we even see a Gallic reconquest of southern Gaul, what's now kind of Provence, framed as Rome coming back and restoring Roman control to this territory that had been lost to barbarians. And so all of this language of Roman decline and restoration is the language that's being used by all of these people in Italy. They're talking about their state in Italy like it's any other Roman state for the last 1,000 years. And so the idea that it fell in 476 would have made no sense to the people living in Italy.
And do you think that this is the propaganda of restoration. Is there a sense that actually that is the reality, that there is a Roman state that could have carried on and continued to be a Roman state in a meaningful way? Because you say the consuls are still there, the Senate is still there, they have a sense of themselves as Roman. So is this, in your view, is this reality that could have turned into and could have grown back into something, obviously not at the scale or the size of the old Roman Empire, but nonetheless of a continuing entity going on down the years?
The capacity was definitely there. Under Theodoric, who's Odoacer's successor, this is the most powerful state in the West, easily. It's able to expand against the Franks. It takes this territory back. It establishes a protectorate over Spain. There's a dynastic marriage with the Vandal kingdom in North Africa that is clearly one where Italy is dominant and the junior partner is North Africa. The problem is after Theodoric in the latter years of his reign has trouble managing dynamics within the Italian aristocracy, in part because of pressure coming from Constantinople and this idea of reconquest. But also after Theodoric dies, the quality of leadership really diminishes radically. But it's possible to imagine that without Eastern pressure, there is a way to build a kind of Roman aristocratic structure that integrates these Gothic leaders in a very effective fashion. And this state remains the dominant power in the West. With the reconquest from the East, though, the dominant sort of structure, the dominant power in the West moves north of the Alps. It becomes the Frankish kingdom. And so we get, as we moved into, the 9th century, 8th, 9th century, what we begin to see is Italy is fractured because of the failures of the Justinianic reconquest. And so the center of power in the West is able to move to the north of the Alps, where it had never really been before. And so I think that what we could imagine is the 5th century, late 5th, early 6th century Italian state, if it was left alone, could have evolved in such a way where the center of power remains where it had been for 1,000 years in Italy.
And what is the damage done? Because the wars of Justinian, he is successful, isn't he? He does pretty much bring Italy back under his control. What is the cost to the Italians?
It's an incredibly devastating set of campaigns because this is back and forth warfare for the better part of almost 20 years. Milan, which was probably the second largest city in Italy at the beginning of this campaign, is completely destroyed. Its citizens are either enslaved or killed. It's gone as a city. The city of Rome collapses from probably a few 100,000 people to maybe 50,000 by the end of the wars against the Goths. The city of Ravenna also changes hands multiple times. And so what you had beginning really in kind of the 3rd century BC was a Roman sort of urban structure that bound all of Italy together that made it incredibly prosperous. And made, the sophistication of the infrastructure and the economic integration such that Italy was wealthy, not because it possessed abundant resources, but because it was very, very well developed. And that development is destroyed. This warfare it goes back and forth across the peninsula to such a degree that a lot of that infrastructure, especially in northern Italy, where you have the capacity for these large cities, it's just devastated. And it means that in the 570s, when there is an invasion by the Lombards from the north, Italy doesn't have the internal resources to respond to this. It just simply cannot mobilize enough resources to do anything about it. And the loss of that urban infrastructure and that kind of integrated economic and social structure is really profound. And it's something that, of course, Italy doesn't really fully get back until the 19th century.
One of the differences between the Eastern Romans and the Western Romans is that they begin to take a different path in terms of religion. I think Gibbon is quite famous for saying that Christianity was one of the causes of the decline of the Roman Empire. I don't quite know what he meant by that, because I'm ashamed to say I haven't actually read Gibbon in any detail. But there is this sense that the Romans wasted so much of their strength on internal disputes about theology. Was this true between the Rome of Justinian and the Rome of the Italians at the time of the Justinian reconquest, or does that come later?
So Justinian is an interesting sovereign because he's a Latin speaker from the Balkans. So he belongs in the Eastern Roman territory. But when we think of the Eastern Roman Empire, we think of a Greek-speaking area. And Justinian is not a native Greek speaker. He's from basically what's now Macedonia, northern Macedonia. And so he is a Latin speaker. And so when he begins conceiving of the reconquest of the West, first of all, he's very interested in this because his orientation, even though he's a citizen of and a resident of and has always been part of the Eastern Roman Empire, he's inclined a lot more to the theological ideas and the structures that you see in the West. And so he's going to be particularly amenable to the idea of Western reconquest. But what you also have at that moment is a breakdown of a kind of theological consensus that is a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy about the Council of Chalcedon that has basically created about a generation of religious peace in the East. And there's pressure from a group of anti-Chalcedonians at precisely the time that Justinian is looking to the West to break down this sort of consensus that we're just not going to talk about this anymore. Now, the papacy also disagrees with this consensus. And so what Justinian is kind of realizing is that this consensus to not talk about Chalcedon it's unstable from the East, but it's also unstable from the West. And the papacy doesn't matter if the West doesn't matter. But for Justinian, when he's looking to the West, the papacy does matter. And so Justinian does create this kind of really serious tension in the Eastern Roman Church because he's looking to cater favor with the West. And it creates divisions that are significant, but I think we also overstate the consequences of those divisions because a lot of our sources want to talk about this. You know, a lot of the sources that we have, especially in the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Syriac Orthodox Church, this is the formative period for those churches. And so some of the most important saints in the Coptic Orthodox or the Syrian Orthodox Church are active by pushing against Justinian. And so it is important. It's very important. But it's not going to overthrow the political dynamics of the empire. There are no armed revolts against Justinian in these cities in the East because of theology. There's no kind of threat to his power base or to the structure of the Roman Empire itself because of these theological problems. But they are real problems for an emperor who's trying to build support. It doesn't make him particularly well liked in these areas. And he created that problem himself. There were ways to deal with this that would have been less disruptive. And so I agree that these are real significant issues for emperors if they choose to make them significant issues. And Justinian just had no capacity to take something that could be a problem and let it sort of slide so it wasn't a problem.
One of the things that interested me, what you said there, was that Justinian was a Latin speaker, and I guess he'd be one of the last Latin-speaking emperors of the East. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but
I think
that's my sense. But I just noticed a little bit that there seems to be at the moment in the air a debate about whether the Byzantines were Roman or not. And I wondered, is this a long-running debate, or is this something that's new? And if so, A, where do you come down on that? Is it even a legitimate question? And why, if I'm right, why is it becoming an issue at the moment? Sorry if that's a pile of questions.
I think the question is, what do we call them versus what do they call themselves? Because they call themselves Romans. They call their state Romania. They call their language Romaica. I mean, they call everything about themselves Roman. And if you're being honest, everybody around them also calls them Romans. So like when the Seljuks take over territory from them, they call it the Sultanate of Rum because they are Romans. You know, one of the titles of the Ottoman Sultan is the Sultan of the Rumi because he's controlling the Romans. So this is not a debatable thing for the people we're talking about. And then the question becomes, is it right to take a group of people and just say, well, yeah, I mean, you lived 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, and you called yourself this, but we don't feel like acknowledging that. You know, you're taking something very significant, a very significant part of somebody's identity away for really no reason except it's convenient for you to do it. But the reason that we are more inclined to do this is because in the 9th century, 8th and 9th century, you have popes in Italy and Charlemagne in the West who basically say, well, yeah, they're not Roman anymore. You know, they lose that title. They're Greeks. They're not Romans. And this is how you get to the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, where you have popes basically who are subjects of these emperors in Constantinople, gradually kind of through various machinations, getting independence as first a Roman Republic of St. Peter, and then ultimately recognizing Charlemagne as a Roman emperor, and claiming that the people in the East are actually heretical Greeks and they don't deserve this title anymore. This is something that Luther says is the popes robbing the Greeks of the Roman Empire. And there's a lot.
Well, Luther actually says that.
Luther actually says that. Yeah.
How interesting.
And there's a lot to that. It is actually, you know, it becomes a justification for Carolingian campaign against the Eastern Empire, against the Romans. It eventually becomes part of how the Fourth Crusade justifies taking Constantinople. And so when we call people in the East, not by the name they would use, but by a name we want to use, we're not doing anything as profoundly damaging as taking Constantinople, but we are denying them something. We are taking something away from them. And so I think I'm not comfortable doing that, because I would not be comfortable if somebody 500 years from now says, yeah, I mean, yeah, you said you were American, but, you know, after 2016, there was no America anymore. It all, you know, lived in Alabama and Mississippi. It didn't live in California anymore, so you're not American. I would not feel that someone 500 years from now has the right to do that to me. And I don't feel like I have the right to do that to somebody who lived 600 years ago or 1,000 years ago or 1,200 years ago.
I mean, you say it's not as bad as the Fourth Crusade, and obviously it's not, and yet it does feel like in some way you're complicit in the justifications that were around at the time, that these aren't proper Romans. So what we do is, for various reasons, justified. So
I feel as historians, generally speaking, if somebody in the past tells us that this is who they are, we need to accept that unless we have really, really, really compelling evidence that they're lying, because they understand their situation better than we ever could. And if that's what they feel is right, who are we to take that identity away from them?
And yet, in the case of the Byzantines, we're kind of stuck now, aren't we? Because it is kind of useful.
Well, especially when you are dealing with, say, you know, the Holy Roman Empire or some of these other, you know, entities. We're used to calling these people Byzantines. And if you call them Eastern Romans or Romans based in Constantinople or whatever you choose to use, it doesn't really work. And so when, say, you're writing about people in the city of Rome, talking to Charlemagne, who claims to be a Holy Roman Emperor, and also engaging with people in Constantinople, you've got a lot of Romans who have like really problematic kind of ways of talking about being Roman, and they're not all Romans in the same way. And so it is really easy to fall back on talking about people in the Eastern Empire as Byzantines. And for clarity's sake, I think it's really tough to do anything else. But I think if we are making those divisions, we have to acknowledge those are actually the real Romans. You know, the papacy creating its fictional, using the donation of Constantine, Republic of St. Peter, they're asserting something that doesn't exist. They're inserting something new. Charlemagne is asserting something new. And the people we call the Byzantines are the people who are not asserting something new. They're the people who belong to the state that started, you know, in the 8th century in the city of Rome. And they're the people who claim an identity that they're, you know, in some of their cases, their ancestors have had by the time the empire falls for, you know, 1600 years. They shouldn't be the ones who lose the title, but I completely understand why they are.
Well, maybe they deserve it because under Justinian they do strangle the Western Roman Empire. So if you're going to carry on like that, maybe it's fair that history pays you back in some small way. Look, I think that's great. We could go on talking. There's a bunch of other things, but I kind of feel like we've gone on quite a long time. So maybe we ought to draw it to an end there.
Sounds good.
Look, thank you so much for that. That's great. And by the way, I really, really enjoyed the book. It's great the way you've got this sort of overarching theme, and you sort of got this helicopter view of the whole thing. But at the same time, it's filled with detail, filled with individual stories, so that you never sort of disappear up into the realms of theory. It's an absolutely terrific read.
I really, really appreciate that, and I think it's really important when you have these kinds of stories that you get at the people. Because the people are what makes this fascinating, and the individual decisions are what make us understand exactly why things happen. So I'm really glad that you saw that and that came through in the book.
No, definitely. Okay, thank you so much, and I hope maybe one day, if we can manage to arrange it, we could talk either about Hypatia or about the fall of the Republic.
That would be wonderful. I would really look forward to that.
Thank you very much, Ed. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
Well, that's the end of today's show. I hope you enjoyed listening, and if you did, do please join me for the next episode. And if you have the time, please do recommend me to your friends. And a share on social media and maybe a review on iTunes really helps my guests get the audience they deserve. Goodbye for now.